In the furthest reaches of the Andromeda spiral, where twin crimson suns cast eternal twilight across crystalline mountains, stood the Obsidian Empire. At its heart rose the Crimson Citadel, a fortress carved from living volcanic glass that pulsed with inner fire. Here ruled Empress Valeria Nightstorm, a being whose very name made seasoned warriors tremble, and whose presence could silence the roar of 1,000 armies. Valeria was not born to rule through kindness. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, with skin that shimmered like polished obsidian and eyes that glowed with the fierce amber of molten gold, she was a vision of terrifying beauty. Her long midnight hair flowed like liquid shadow, and when she moved, the air itself seemed to bend around her presence. She had been forged in the crucible of war, tempered by betrayal, and hardened by the weight of an empire that demanded absolute strength from its ruler. The Obsidian Empire sprawled across 17 star systems, each one conquered not through diplomacy, but through the sheer force of Valeria's will. She commanded legions of nightborn warriors, beings of shadow and flame, who served her with unwavering devotion. Her generals were legends in their own right, each one capable of reducing entire worlds to ash with a single command. Yet none of them had ever seen their empress show weakness, emotion, or anything resembling vulnerability in the grand throne room of the Crimson Citadel. Alien dignitaries from across the galaxy would prostrate themselves before her obsidian throne, their voices trembling as they offered tribute or begged for mercy. Trade princes would arrive with chests full of rare crystals and exotic technologies, only to leave with half their offerings and grateful to keep their lives. Even the proudest warrior kings would kneel before her, their armor clattering as they bent the knee to the one being in the galaxy they truly feared. But Valeria felt nothing for their fear, their worship, or their desperate attempts to curry favor. She ruled from a throne of ice, her heart as cold and unreachable as the void between stars. Love was a weakness she could not afford. Trust was a luxury that had been beaten out of her by years of assassination attempts and political betrayals. She existed in a state of perfect, terrible isolation, surrounded by millions of subjects, but connected to none of them. The Empress spent her days in the strategy chambers, planning the expansion of her empire or the crushing of rebellious worlds. Her nights were filled with combat training, honing her already devastating abilities until she could split mountains with her bare hands or call down lightning from clear skies. She was perfection incarnate, a being of such power and control that some whispered she had transcended mortality itself. The crash that changed everything on the night when 3 moons aligned over the Crimson Citadel, casting the sky in shades of silver and blood. Something unprecedented happened. A human transport vessel, battered and burning, streaked across the forbidden atmosphere of Valeria's homeworld like a falling star. The ship's engines screamed in protest as it tore through the upper atmospheric layers, its hull glowing white-hot from the friction of uncontrolled descent. The vessel crashed in the desolation fields, a wasteland of razor-sharp crystal formations and geothermal vents that lay beyond the Citadel's outer walls. It was a place where even her most elite guards rarely ventured, where the very air shimmered with toxic vapors and the ground could open into molten chasms without warning. Most expected whatever had survived the crash to be dead within hours, claimed by the hostile environment or the predatory crystal wraiths that haunted the wasteland. But the distress beacon continued to pulse through the night, its signal weak but persistent. More troubling was the species designation that appeared on the Citadel's sensors. Human. It had been over a century since any human vessel had entered Obsidian space, and never had one dared to approach the Empress's personal domain. The very audacity of it intrigued Valeria in a way that surprised her, against the urgent protests of her advisors and the bewildered stares of her guards. Valeria decided to investigate the crash personally. She donned her battle armor, plates of midnight black, metal that seemed to absorb light itself, and summoned her personal transport. As she flew over the crystalline wasteland, her amber eyes scanning the wreckage below, she found herself genuinely curious for the first time in decades. The human ship had carved a scar nearly a mile long through the crystal formations. final resting place marked by a crater of melted stone and twisted metal. Steam rose from the wreckage, and the air thrummed with the dying energy of damaged power cores. It should have been a tomb, a monument to the folly of entering her domain. Uninvited, instead, as Valeria's transport touched down at the crater's edge, she saw something that made her pause. A figure was moving in the wreckage, not crawling or stumbling, but walking with purpose through the smoke and debris. The thermal scan showed elevated life signs, indicating not just survival, but active recovery from what should have been fatal. Injuries. The human who did not bow Captain Jackson Reed emerged from the smoking ruins of his transport like a warrior born from fire itself. His military uniform was torn and scorched, his dark hair matted with blood and ash, but his green eyes burned with undiminished determination. He carried himself with the confident stride of a man who had stared death in the face and refused to blink. Despite the obvious pain from his injuries, Jackson was everything the Empress had not expected from a human. He stood just over 6 feet tall, his build lean but powerful, with the kind of physical presence that came from years of combat experience. Scars crossed his visible skin like a roadmap of battles fought and survived, and there was something in his bearing that spoke of unbreakable will wrapped in deceptively casual confidence. As Valeria approached, her footsteps causing the crystalline ground to crack and glow with inner fire. Most beings would have fallen to their knees in terror or worship. Her presence was a physical force, a weight that pressed down on the minds and souls of those around her. The very air grew thick with power, and reality seemed to bend slightly around her form. But Jackson simply looked up from the salvage he was pulling from the wreckage, took in her imposing figure and obvious authority, and straightened to his full height. His eyes met hers directly, without fear or challenge, just honest assessment. When he spoke, his voice was steady and tinged with dry humor despite his circumstances. "Well, you're definitely not the rescue team I was expecting," he said, wiping blood from a cut on his forehead. "I've got to say, the local hospitality committee has quite an impressive entrance. I'm Captain Jackson Reed, formerly of the Terran Defense Corps, currently of nowhere in particular thanks to some very unfriendly pirates and a navigation system with trust issues." The Empress stared at him, genuinely taken aback for the first time in her long reign. Her amber eyes searched his face for signs of the fear or awe that she was accustomed to inspiring, but found only alert intelligence and what might have been amusement. Her guard contingent, having landed behind her, stood frozen in shock at witnessing someone address their Empress so casually. "You dare speak to the Empress of the Obsidian Empire as though she were your equal," hissed Commander Thorne. Her chief of security, his hand moving to his weapon. "Kneel before her Imperial Majesty, or face immediate execution." Jackson glanced at the commander, then back at Valeria, raising an eyebrow. "Empress, huh? That explains the dramatic armor and the entourage of people who look like they could press a starship. Should I be doing something special right now? Because I've got to be honest, alien etiquette wasn't covered in basic training." For a moment that stretched like eternity, the wasteland fell completely silent, except for the distant hiss of cooling metal and escaping steam. Valeria's guards waited for her command to strike down this insolent human who dared treat their goddess Semprist like an ordinary person. Very crystals around them seemed to hold their breath, sensing the tension that could explode into violence at any moment. But instead of rage or indignation, Valeria felt something she had not experienced in centuries: genuine surprise. This human looked at her not as a force of nature to be feared or a deity to be worshipped, but simply as another person. There was respect in his manner, but not submission. Interest, but not desperation. He was treating her like an equal, and the novelty of it was almost overwhelming. "You crashed on my world without permission," she said, her voice carrying the resonance of controlled power. "You survive what should have been certain death. You show no fear in my presence. Tell me, human, are you brave or simply foolish?" Jackson considered this seriously, as though it were a genuine question rather than a potential death sentence. "It's probably a bit of both, Your Majesty. But I've found that the line between bravery and foolishness usually depends on whether you survive. The experience, since I'm still breathing and having this conversation, I'm going to lean toward calling it bravery for now. Despite herself, despite centuries of rigid control and emotional isolation, Valeria felt her lips curve in what might have been the beginning of a smile. This human was either the most suicidally confident being she had ever met, or he possessed a strength of character that was rarer than any precious metal in her vast empire. "You will come with me to the Citadel," she commanded, though her tone lacked its usual edge of absolute authority. "Your presence here requires investigation, and your fate will be decided after proper consideration." "Sounds reasonable, Jackson," agreed, shouldering a salvage pack from his ruined ship. "Lead the way, Your Majesty. Well, I should probably mention that I'm not great with formal dinner parties if that's where this is heading. I tend to use the wrong fork and ask inappropriate questions about local politics." As they walked toward her transport, Valeria found herself glancing sideways at this strange human, who treated potential execution like an inconvenient social obligation. For the first time in her reign, she was bringing someone to her citadel, not as prisoner or supplicant, but as something far more dangerous and intriguing, an equal, who refused to be anything less. The crimson suns were setting as they rose into the darkening sky, casting long shadows across the crystalline wasteland. Behind them, the wreckage of Jackson's ship continued to smolder, marking the spot where the most powerful empress in the galaxy had met the one man who would dare to look her in the eyes and smile. The palace of impossible things, the Crimson Citadel, rose before them like a monument to power itself, its obsidian spires piercing the star-filled sky, while rivers of molten crystal flowed through channels carved into its living walls. As their transport approached the main landing platform, Jackson pressed his face to the viewport, watching in genuine wonder as the structure revealed its impossible architecture. Bridges of crystallized energy connected floating towers, while gardens of bioluminescent flora created cascades of color that shifted with each passing moment. "It's beautiful," he said simply, and Valeria found herself seeing her home through his eyes for the first time in centuries. Where she had grown accustomed to the displays of power and wealth, he saw artistry and wonder. Where she saw the tools of intimidation, he saw genuine magnificence. Word of the humans' arrival had spread through the citadel like wildfire. As they disembarked, crowds of courtiers, nobles, and servants had gathered to witness this unprecedented event. The obsidian nobility were beings of ethereal beauty and terrible power, their forms shifting between solid matter and living shadow, their eyes glowing with inner fire. They whispered among themselves in voices like distant thunder, their gazes fixed on the human who walked beside their empress without chains or guards. Jackson took in the assembled crowd with the same calm assessment he had shown in the wasteland. When a particularly imposing duke stepped forward and began a formal challenge to the human's presence, speaking in the ancient ceremonial tongue that carried undertones of threat and dominance, Jackson simply listened politely until the tirade finished. "I'm sorry," he said to Valeria, "but I think your friend here is upset about something. Don't speak the language, but the tone suggests he's either challenging me to combat or asking about my warranty information. Either way, I should probably point out that I'm still technically a guest here." The Duke sputtered in outrage at being called a friend, while several courtiers hissed at the casual disrespect. But Valeria surprised everyone, including herself, by placing a restraining hand on the Duke's arm. "Captain Reed is under my personal protection," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of absolute law. "Any who would challenge that decision may address their concerns to me directly." The crowd fell silent. In the history of the Obsidian Empire, the Empress had never placed anyone under her personal protection who was not family or sworn nobility. The implications rippled through the assembled court like shockwaves, and Jackson found himself the center of attention in ways that were both fascinating and potentially lethal. Learning to live among gods, Valeria assigned Jackson quarters in the Tower of Honored Guests, a spire reserved for visiting royalty and diplomatic envoys. The rooms were vast and luxurious, with walls that showed real-time views of distant nebulae and furniture that adjusted itself to his preferences through some form of advanced technology. But what impressed him most was the library, a circular chamber lined floor to ceiling with data crystals containing the accumulated knowledge of 17 civilizations. He spent his first week immersing himself in the culture and history of the Obsidian Empire, learning about the wars that had forged it and the traditions that sustained it. The more he learned, the more he understood the weight that Valeria carried on her shoulders. She was not just a ruler, but a living symbol, a force of nature that held together an empire, built on strength and maintained through fear. But he also saw things that the historical records did not mention. He'd watched her during the daily court sessions, seeing how she navigated the complex web of noble politics with surgical precision. He observed her in the strategy chambers, where her tactical brilliance was matched only by her genuine concern for the welfare of her people. Most telling of all, he noticed the moments when she thought no one was watching, when the weight of absolute power showed in the tired set of her shoulders or the distant sadness in her glowing eyes. Valeria, for her part, found herself increasingly intrigued by her unusual guest. Unlike her nobles, who spoke in flowery metaphors and hidden meanings, Jackson communicated with refreshing directness. When she asked his opinion on military strategy, he gave honest assessments without trying to flatter or manipulate. When she shared concerns about trade negotiations, he offered practical solutions based on human diplomatic experience. More unsettling was how he treated her during their private conversations. He did not grovel or worship, simply talked to her as though she were a person rather than a living deity. He asked about her childhood, her dreams, her fears, questions that no one had dared pose in centuries. At first, she deflected with imperial authority, but his genuine interest and complete lack of ulterior motive gradually wore down her defenses. "Tell me about Earth," she said one evening, as they stood on her private balcony watching the aurora storms that danced across the upper atmosphere. "What was it like to live among your own kind?" Jackson leaned against the railing, his expression thoughtful, complicated, beautiful, messy, in the best possible way. "Humans are not a perfect species, but we have this amazing capacity to hope for better things. Even when everything seems impossible, we fight and argue and make terrible mistakes. But we also create art and music and stories that can move you to tears." "Do you miss it?" she asked, surprised by how much his answer mattered to her. "Parts of it," he admitted. "I miss the sound of rain on a metal roof, and the way coffee tastes in the morning, and the feeling of belonging somewhere. But I have to say the company here is fairly extraordinary." She turned to look at him, catching the gentle teasing in his tone. "You find my court entertaining?" "I find you fascinating," he said simply, and the honesty in his voice made her breath catch. "You are the most powerful being I have ever met, but you are also the loneliest. You carry the weight of an empire, but you have no one to share that burden with. It seems like a terrible way to live." For a moment, Valeria felt her carefully constructed walls wavering. Loneliness is the price of absolute power. To rule effectively, one must remain above emotional entanglements. "Says who?" Jackson challenged gently. "Because from where I am standing, it looks like you are so busy being an empress that you have forgotten how to be a person. And that seems like a waste of someone truly remarkable." The seeds of rebellion as weeks passed and Jackson's presence became a fixture in the citadel. The murmurs of discontent among the nobility grew louder. Duke Corin, the empress's cousin, and a longtime rival for influence, began gathering support among the more traditional factions. They whispered that the human was corrupting their goddess Shrimpris, making her weak and sentimental. Some even suggested that he was using some form of alien mind control to cloud her judgment. The breaking point came during the Festival of Crimson Stars, the Empire's most sacred celebration. By tradition, the Empress would demonstrate her power by calling down lightning from the storm-filled sky, a display that reaffirmed her divine right to rule. But this year, as she stood before the assembled thousands in the great courtyard, something was different. Jackson stood beside her on the platform. His presence seemed to calm the fierce energy that normally crackled around her form. When she raised her hands to summon the lightning, the storm clouds gathered, but the strikes were controlled, precise, beautiful rather than terrifying. Instead of cowering in fear, the crowd watched in wonder as she painted the sky with threads of silver fire. "She grows weak," Duke Corin hissed to his supporters in the shadows. The human has poisoned her mind with softness. She is no longer fit to rule the Obsidian Empire. But Valeria was not growing weak. She was discovering strength she had never known existed. The rigid control she had maintained for centuries was evolving into something more flexible and far more powerful. Where once she had ruled through fear alone, she was learning to inspire loyalty through respect and genuine care for her people. Jackson saw the change in her and marveled at the woman emerging from behind the imperial mask. When she laughed at his stories of human customs, the sound was like music in the sterile corridors of power. When she showed him her private gardens, where she cultivated rare flowers from across the galaxy, he saw the artist hidden beneath the warrior's facade. "You are changing," he told her one night as they walked through the bioluminescent grove. At the heart of her personal sanctuary, "You are becoming more yourself, not less." "My advisors believe I am becoming compromised," she replied, her fingers trailing over the petals of a flower that bloomed only in starlight. "They say that emotions are a weakness that will destroy everything I have built." "Your advisors are idiots," Jackson said bluntly, making her laugh despite the seriousness of the conversation. "Emotions are not weakness. They are what makes strength meaningful. You are not less of an empress because you have remembered how to feel. You are more of one because you finally have something worth protecting beyond your own power." She stopped walking and turned to face him, her amber eyes searching his face in the ethereal light. "And what is it that I am protecting?" "Hope," he said, stepping closer. "The possibility that power and compassion can coexist. The chance that your empire can be something more than just a weapon pointed at the galaxy. And you," she whispered, "what are you protecting?" "You," he answered, without hesitation. "Not the empress, not the legend, but the woman who grows flowers in secret and dreams of a better world. You are worth protecting. Valeria Nightstorm, not because of your power, but because of your heart." The distance between them vanished as she moved into his arms, and when their lips met, it was like the collision of stars. She had kissed before, cold political alliances sealed with ceremonial contact, but this was something entirely different. This was warmth and desire, and the terrifying vulnerability of letting someone see her without armor or pretense. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she rested her forehead against his. "I have never felt this way before," she confessed. "It terrifies me more than any battle I have ever fought," Goody said, his hands gentle on her face. "That means it matters. That means it is real." The price of love, but their growing connection, did not go unnoticed. Duke Corin's faction had been watching, gathering evidence of what they saw as the Empress's weakness. They began to plan, reaching out to old enemies of the Empire who had been waiting for any sign of vulnerability. If the Empress had been compromised by human influence, then perhaps it was time for new leadership. The first sign of trouble came during a routine council meeting, when several noble houses failed to appear for mandatory attendance. Intelligence. Reports began filtering in of military movements in the outer systems, ships gathering in formations that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. Most alarming of all, communications from the frontier worlds had gone silent, her automated beacons suddenly dark. Valeria stood in her command center, studying the tactical displays with growing concern. "It is a coordinated rebellion," she said, her voice tight with anger. "They mean to test whether my supposed weakness extends to military command." Jackson stood beside her, his expression grim as he analyzed the data. "They are not just testing you. They are trying to force you into a position where you have to choose between me and your empire." She turned to him, her eyes blazing with fury. "There is no choice. You are part of this empire now, part of me. Anyone who threatens that threatens everything I hold dear." "Valeria," he said gently, catching her hand in his, "you cannot fight a war just to keep one human. Your people need you to be their empress first." "My people need me to be strong," she replied fiercely. "And you make me stronger, not weaker. Together, we are more than either of us could be alone." The rebellion erupted across 3 star systems simultaneously, catching the Imperial forces off guard with their coordination and brutality. Duke Corrin had promised the rebel world's freedom from imperial tyranny, claiming that the Empress had been compromised by alien influence and was no longer capable of effective leadership. Old grievances were aired. Ancient enemies emerged from hiding. Suddenly, the Obsidian Empire was fighting for its very existence. But if the rebels expected to face a weakened opponent, they were catastrophically wrong. Valeria threw herself into the campaign with a fury that surprised even her most veteran commanders. She did not lead from the safety of the Citadel, but took personal command of the Imperial fleet, striking at rebel strongholds with precision and devastating effect. And beside her, proving his worth in ways that silenced even the most skeptical critics, stood Jackson Reed. His human tactical experience proved invaluable in countering strategies that had never been seen in this galaxy. His ability to think outside the rigid patterns of Obsidian military doctrine allowed them to outmaneuver forces that should have had every advantage. More importantly, his presence seemed to unlock new aspects of Valeria's power. Where once she had been a force of pure destruction, now she became something more subtle and far more dangerous. She could inspire her troops to impossible acts of courage, intimidate enemies into surrender without firing a shot, and coordinate complex battle plans with an intuition that bordered on prescience. The Siege of Hearts. The final confrontation came at the Nexus of Shadows, an ancient battleground where the first emperors had established their dominion over the stars. Duke Corrin had chosen the location deliberately, hoping that the symbolic weight of history would legitimize his claim to power. His combined fleet stretched across the void like a dark constellation. Ships from a dozen rebel worlds united in their determination to end what they saw as the Empress's weakness. Valeria's Imperial fleet emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation, their obsidian hulls gleaming like black diamonds against the starfield. At the center of the formation flew the Crimson Throne, the Empress's flagship, its massive weapons arrays already charging with deadly energy. But those who expected to see the familiar sight of their goddess Empress standing alone on the command deck were surprised to find her flanked by the human who had somehow earned a place at her side. "This is your final chance to surrender." Valeria's voice echoed across all communication channels, carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Return to your worlds, acknowledge your crimes, and accept the mercy I am willing to grant. Continue this rebellion and face the consequences of defying the Obsidian Empire." Duke Corrin's response crackled with contempt. "We do not acknowledge the authority of a compromised ruler. You have been corrupted by alien influence, made weak by human sentiment. The Empire demands a leader who embodies our strength, not one who bows to foreign weakness." Jackson stepped forward, his own voice calm, but carrying clearly across the fleet communications. "For the record, she has never bowed to me. In fact, I am not sure she is physically capable of bowing to anyone. But she has learned something that apparently escaped your education. True strength comes from having something worth fighting for beyond your own power." "Silence, human," Corrin snarled. "You will not live to see another day. When this battle ends, your corrupting influence will be purged from our empire forever." "The only thing being purged today," Valeria said, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper, "is the delusion that rebellion against the rightful Empress can ever succeed. When gods go to war, the battle that followed was unlike anything in the recorded history of galactic warfare. Two massive fleets crashed together in the void like opposing storms, their weapons lighting up space with deadly fireworks of energy and destruction. The rebel forces fought with the desperation of those who knew that failure meant extinction, while the Imperial fleet fought with the disciplined fury of soldiers defending their sovereign. But the real battle was taking place on a smaller scale. As Valeria and Jackson led strike forces deep into the heart of the enemy formation, the Empress moved through combat like a force of nature unleashed, her personal fighter craft dancing between massive dreadnoughts, while she carved through their defenses with impossible precision. Energy beams that should have vaporized her ship instead curved around her like water around a stone, deflected by the sheer force of her will. Beside her, Jackson flew with the skill of a master pilot and the tactical genius of a born strategist. His human reflexes, evolved in the gravity well of Earth, allowed him to execute maneuvers that no other species could match. More importantly, his ability to anticipate enemy movements based on psychological analysis rather than tactical doctrine gave them advantages that the rebels could not counter. "Coming up on the command ship," Jackson reported as they weaved through the defensive fire of Duke Corrin's flagship. "Looks like he is trying to run for the hyperspace jump point." "He will not escape," Valeria replied, her voice carrying harmonics of power that made reality itself tremble. "This ends here. This ends now." She reached out with abilities that transcended mere technology, her consciousness touching the quantum foundations of space itself. Around Corrin's ship, the fabric of reality began to twist and solidify, creating a barrier that made hyperspace travel impossible. He was trapped, cut off from retreat, forced to face the consequences of his choices. The boarding action that followed was swift and brutal. Valeria led her elite guard through the rebel flagship's corridors like an unstoppable tide of retribution, while Jackson coordinated tactical strikes that neutralized key systems and prevented organized resistance. They moved together with perfect synchronization, two beings who had learned to trust each other completely in the crucible of battle. The heart laid bare, they found Duke Corrin on his ship's bridge, surrounded by the remnants of his command staff, and defiant to the end. He was a being of terrible beauty, his obsidian heritage giving him the appearance of a living statue carved from midnight stone. When he saw Valeria enter, his eyes blazed with fury and something that might have been genuine pain. "Cousin," he said, using the formal address that emphasized their family connection. "You have fallen so far from what you once were. Our ancestors would weep to see what you have become." "Our ancestors," Valeria replied, removing her helmet to reveal the full force of her presence, "built this empire through strength, but they also understood that strength must evolve or become brittle. You have confused rigidity with power, isolation with security, and you have confused weakness with love," Corrin shot back. "This human has made you soft, sentimental, unfit to rule beings of our power and heritage. Look at yourself, standing beside an alien as though he were your equal." "He is my equal," Valeria said simply, and the quiet certainty in her voice carried more weight than any shout. "Not in power, perhaps, but in everything that truly matters. He has courage without cruelty, strength without tyranny, and a heart large enough to love someone despite their flaws." Jackson stepped forward, his weapon lowered but ready. "Your Grace, this does not have to end in more bloodshed. The rebellion is over. Your forces are defeated. Surrender now, and you can live to see a better future for your people." Corrin laughed bitterly, a human offering mercy to obsidian nobility. "The degradation is complete." His hand moved toward a concealed weapon but froze as Valeria's power surrounded him like a crushing weight. "You will not harm him," she said, and for the first time in the battle, there was genuine emotion in her voice. It's not the cold fury of an offended empress, but the protective rage of a woman defending the man she loved. "He has shown you more courtesy than you deserve, cousin. Do not make me demonstrate what happens to those who threaten what I treasure most." The raw power radiating from her was enough to crack the deck plating and make the air itself glow with residual energy. But beneath the display of force, Corrin suddenly saw something that made him pause. This was not the controlled, calculated fury he remembered from their childhood. This was the protective instinct of someone who had found something worth more than power itself. "You truly love him," he said, wonder replacing anger in his voice. "This is not political manipulation or strategic alliance. You actually care more for this human than for your own imperial dignity." "I love him more than my throne, more than my power, more than my life," Valeria admitted, her voice soft but carrying absolute conviction. "He has given me something I never knew I was missing. The knowledge that I am worthy of love, not because of what I can do, but because of who I am." Jackson moved to stand beside her, his hand finding hers despite the energy still crackling around. "Her form, and she has taught me that strength and gentleness are not opposites, that power can be used to protect rather than destroy. Together we are building something better than either of us could achieve alone." The new empire Duke Corrin's surrender marked the end of the rebellion, but it was also the beginning of something unprecedented in galactic history. The Obsidian Empire, long feared for its militaristic expansion and ruthless efficiency, began to change under the influence of its empress's transformed perspective. Trade relationships replaced conquest. Diplomatic solutions were sought before military ones, and the emperor's personal happiness became a symbol of hope for billions of subjects who had never dared to dream of their own fulfillment. The wedding ceremony took place in the Grand Cathedral of Stars, a magnificent structure that existed partially in normal space and partially in the quantum realm, allowing beings from across the galaxy to witness the unprecedented union. Representatives from hundreds of worlds came to pay their respects, many of them former enemies who had been won over by the new direction of imperial policy. Valeria stood at the altar in robes that seemed to be woven from captured starlight, her imposing presence softened by genuine joy. Beside her, Jackson wore the formal uniform of an imperial consort, a rank created specifically for him that acknowledged his unique position as the Empress's equal partner rather than subordinate spouse. When the ancient vows were spoken, promising not just political alliance, but genuine emotional partnership, the very stars seemed to shine more brightly. As they kissed to seal their union, waves of benevolent energy rippled outward from the cathedral, carrying with them a new understanding of what power could become when tempered with love. "Do you ever regret it?" Jackson asked her later as they stood together on the balcony of their private chambers, watching the aurora storms that had become gentler and more beautiful since their union. Giving up the simplicity of absolute rule for the complications of partnership? Valeria smiled, her amber eyes soft with contentment as she leaned into his embrace. "I regret nothing. For centuries I ruled an empire, but I'd never truly lived. You taught me the difference between existing and being alive, between commanding respect and earning love." "And you taught me that strength comes in many forms," he replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "That someone can be powerful enough to move mountains and still choose gentleness. That a heart can be both fierce and tender." Around them, the crimson citadel hummed with new energy, its crystalline structures resonating with harmonics of contentment and hope. The empire they ruled together was stronger than ever, held together not by fear, but by the genuine desire of its people to be part of something greater than themselves. As the twin suns set over the crystal mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Valeria and Jackson stood together in comfortable silence. They had found something that neither had believed possible, a love strong enough to transform not just their own lives, but the lives of billions across the stars. The woman who had once ruled through isolation had learned to share her strength, and the man who had crashed alone into her world had become the anchor that allowed her power to be guided by wisdom rather than fear. Together, they had created something beautiful from the ashes of what had been, proving that even the mightiest storms could learn to dance with the gentle light of understanding hearts in the distance. The stars themselves seemed to sing with approval, and the universe, vast and mysterious as it was, felt just a little bit warmer for the love that bloomed in the heart of the Obsidian Empire. The end.